Ladies and gentlemen, this is GamingTech.com video. We're going to be discussing DirectX 12 for the Xbox One and also ESRAM performance improvements, which are said to be about 15% thanks to some changes to PIX, which is Performance Investigator for Xbox One. Now, this is also an article where I go into a lot more detail regarding some specific things that I've covered a couple of times before. There are also links to sources and other bits and bobs which you might find pertinent. Obviously, that is linked once again in the video's description. You can tell how attentive I'm being already. So, to give you the headlines, the Xbox ESRAM will be receiving a boost in performance thanks to additional tools available to developers. Basically, these tools allow them to profile the best way to utilize the ESRAM inside the console. Additionally, Microsoft's new API, which of course is DirectX 12, is going to largely benefit from a lower overhead and also a new API for running the ESRAM and greater parallelism from rendering tasks from the CPU. So we're going to be starting things out with some quotes from Brad Wardell. I don't really think he requires much of an introduction, but he is, of course, the CEO of Stardock. And he took to Twitter, as I said, and he's been discussing how Microsoft have been changing the development of the console and combining this information we've had from the early analysis of the GDC presentation we did just yesterday. We can get some idea of what's actually going on with DX12 on the Xbox One. So according to Wardell via a tweet, the Xbox One's resolution largely based on how well the game uses ESRAM. DX11 ESRAM API is difficult, requiring a lot of iteration. So obviously, if this statement is accurate, currently a lot of developers aren't even hitting the GPU performance limit. What they're actually doing is they're just running out of bandwidth or memory on the ESRAM, which is obviously not very ideal. So if you're not too familiar with what iteration is, I have gone into a longer example in the article, but effectively it's just if you need to run a piece of code multiple times, for example, a loop. So if you want to run a piece of code several times over to get until a result occurs or a condition occurs, then that's what an iteration is, which is what he points out you have to do with the Xbox One's APIs at the moment. So if we use this information, we can make some other educated guesses, because he also goes into a blog post and he points out that for the PlayStation 4, it's actually quite easy to get good performance simply because of the architecture of the memory. As you know, it uses GDDR5 RAM, a large pool, whereas the Xbox One uses DRAM, DDR3, 8 gigs of course, running at 68 gigabytes per second peak. And of course ESRAM, which helps to make up the remainder of the performance. And as we discussed in part 3 of our SDK leak, which is also an article and a video if you want to check them out, it's linked in the article, it's linked in this description, but you can also Google it, where Microsoft do say that, hey, you can actually do multiple render targets from different portions of memory. In other words, they gave the example of 70% of the image roughly was being held in ESRAM, which meant that about 11 megabytes of that particular rendered image was being held in ESRAM, while the DRAM had about just under 5 megabytes. So that gives you a bit of an idea of just how much memory the ESRAM's gobbling up just by render targets. It's a lot, considering there's only 32 megabytes and other particular assets have to actually be stored in there as well. It's not just render targets. Sometimes you may want the texture from ESRAM, or you might want to do some compute tasks or what have you. So anyway, if you're actually taking these overheads into account, you're left with about 42 gigabytes per second of bandwidth from the DRAM. These figures are actually from Microsoft themselves, from the SDK leak. So the peak figures of the ESRAM is it's operating at 133 gigabytes per second, but this is best case scenario. In other words, you know, it could certainly be considerably slower. And remember that if you're copying from ESRAM to DRAM or vice versa, or copying even ESRAM to ESRAM, the instruction rate goes down a heck of a lot. Because what you start getting is, let's say that you're copying from ESRAM to DRAM, you can't copy let's just say, for example, to DRAM at 100 gigabytes per second, if the maximum achievable speed for the DRAM is 68, it just doesn't work. The convoy has to sail as fast as the slowest ship in this case. And do remember as well, 68 gigabytes per second is the highest possible achievable number, but in reality it just can't do that, because obviously it's not taking into account other overheads, it's not even taking into account that the operating system is running and so on and so forth. Hence the GPU is left with about 42 gigabytes per second, maybe slightly more if you take into account the Xbox One, obviously with the SDK changes where developers are able to access a partition of the Kinect's reserves, so that would be CPU and bandwidth. So, getting back into the nitty-gritty of things, PIX, which as I said the acronym stands for Performance Investigator for Xbox, is used by developers to figure out, hey, what's going on with my game engine, what's going on with my game, what's going on with this piece of code, and so on and so forth. It had some weaknesses, to be totally honest. The primary one is just that at the start it sucked, which is a major weakness, obviously, but after that it was really slow to figure out what's the best way to get the most out of ESRAM. So, since then, it's improved considerably. And on the SDK analysis, you can actually check this out. Obviously, we don't have the latest SDK leaked, but we do have indications from Brad that now Microsoft have actually given tools, development tools, to actually simulate the best strategies from PIX and figure out what code, what assets, and how developers should split up render targets and other information with the ESRAM. So he said, Brad Wardell, this is where DirectX 12 comes in. They're redoing the APIs to deal with ESRAM, and secondly, they have wonderful tools called PIX, which has been around for a while, that now has a feature, or will do very soon, that lets developers try out different strategies in using ESRAM to see how it performs without having to rebuild the entire project, so they can just simulate it within the tool itself. It's huge. I would agree. And he further clarifies by saying, Microsoft have a new tool for optimizing ESRAM usage. On the demo I saw, it's given about 15% boost. Now, some people are going to say, well, if you look at the pixel count between 900p and 1080p, or 720p to 900p, or XP to another XP, it's more than 15%, and I would concur, but you've got to remember that effectively this is kind of free performance for A, and for B, it's also not taking into account other aspects of the Xbox One, which we're going to discuss in just a moment. So DX12 for the Xbox One does deliver draw bundles, a greater and lesser overhead, parallelism, and also a new ESRAM API, once again via another tweet. And this is further clarified in his blog post, which once again is linked to, in the article. And he points out that DirectX 12 removes the serial requirements, the serialization requirements of DX11, and instead things are going to switch to more of an asynchronous scheduler. If you're not too familiar with what that is, you could check out the GDC 2015 analysis that I did yesterday, which gives you a great indicator. But in a nutshell, it just means that serial instructions are literally just that. The CPU will handle one instruction by one instruction by one instruction. But the problem is, it also really only puts this over one rendering core. So the CPU core 0 just gets really hammered. But with parallel, it tries to split the jobs over as many cores as possible. So typically you'll have one thread, we'll just call it thread 0, which generally runs on the first CPU core, and its job is to delegate work to the remainder of the threads. Okay, so he says that right now the only fully asynchronous schedule, the only engine that's fully asynchronous capable right now is Nitros, that he's aware of anyway. That's the key word. We don't know what X company's working on in the background, but he does say that Unity, Unreal, CryEngine, Frostbite and so on are all coming along, but right now his engine is the only one that basically is fully asynchronously compatible. So, There's a demo that's been floating about, and I say demo, it's basically a phone image from, I believe it's Brad that recorded it, but don't quote me, I'm pretty sure it is Brad. That shows off Ashes of the Singularity, which is running on a high-end PC. I don't know the GPU, it might have been mentioned and I might have just been deaf and missed it, but it's definitely running on an R9 200 series, so let's just assume for the sake of argument it's an R9 290X, because I guess it would be something high-end, since it's married up with an Intel i7 5960X, which handles up to 12 threads. Now, it was running Ashes of the Singularity, which is an RTS by Stardock, and 70% performance boost with DX11. It's worth remembering that that is with an engine that had to be backwardly compatible with DX11 hardware. Wardell points out that they're losing performance because of this. So does that mean suddenly the Xbox One translates to all games are going to be, let's just say, 70% faster? No, not really. In the end, the problem with CPUs right now on the PC is because they've not been a fixed hardware spec. You can have the fastest, you can have the best, you can have like a 12-core CPU. But guess what, my friend? Most likely, only the first 1 to 2 cores are going to do anything. This is particularly true on poorer console ports. They're just going to be like, yeah, it's doing nothing here. The other CPU cores are not going to be doing much at all, unless they're doing background processing for Windows. On the other hand, consoles, you can much better make use of them. Yes, the other rendering threads probably aren't going to exist, although the PS4 I've heard does handle multiple rendering, because we can go back to the GDC analysis of the post-mortem of Killzone, and you can see that they are doing multiple rendering from different cores. And GNM, which is the PS4's low-level API, does support multi-core thread rendering. But for the PC, it doesn't do that. It's basically just functioning just on one CPU core. For the most part, there are other things that you can run on multiple CPUs, for example, AI or audio and blah, but generally this is just how it is. So, with the Xbox One, the GPU specifications are not going to change either. It's still got 1.31 teraflops of computing performance. There's still fewer ROPs in the PS4 and fewer TMUs as well, but that's not the key. The DirectX 12 is not going to magically overclock the the Xbox One's GPU. It's not going to suddenly, you know, make a fairy come alive inside your system and then tinker while you're in bed and, you know, install like a 50 billion T-flop GPU inside the system. Obviously, I'm completely and utterly exaggerating for point here. But what it will do is it will mean that Microsoft are much better able to leverage the hardware that's inside the system. They're able to actually leverage it to the point where games are going to be more detailed, they're going to run faster, and ironically enough, the PS4 and the PC are probably going to benefit from this quite a bit as well. Why the PC? Because, well, it's going to be easier to port titles to and from both systems. But the PS4 is going to benefit because it's probably going to mean that a lot more work, a lot more, how can I put this, code is going to be easier to transport, because effectively they'll actually be able to, assuming the PS4's scheduler and Xbox One's thread schedulers are even slightly similar, what they should be able to do is at least take the basic principles, I imagine, of the engines, and they won't have to, well, how can I put it? They might have to create their game engine with the assumption that most of the rendering is going to be done on just purely one core, which may mean the PS4 is actually going to benefit some from this as well. Because let's just, for the sake of argument, say that a studio knows that only one platform, let's just say for the sake of argument the PS4 is the only one that could benefit from multiple core rendering and so on. So you might get the situation where some studios just cannot be bothered to spend that extra time on the PS4 version when the PC, neither the PC or the Xbox One, are going to really see much benefit from it. It's just possible that that's the case. That's speculation. This is not confirmed by a developer, but it would make some logical sense if you start working out the steps. But obviously, since I don't have DirectX 12 development kit for the Xbox One, I'm just guessing. on that, but it would make some logical sense. So, my personal opinion on this is that you're going to be seeing performance increases on the Xbox One. You're going to be seeing it on the PS4 as well. I realise I'm not discussing the PS4's GDC stuff yet. And quite frankly, the reason behind it is because there was some stuff announced that I don't know too much about yet. I kind of knew a lot about DX12 already, simply because I've been following it from the beginning. But some of you may know about Vulkan. That's Vulkan. Which has been announced, and I don't know as much on it, so I'm comfortable enough to actually do an analysis yet. It's basically going to require me to do quite a lot of reading up. From what I do know about it, it's looking very impressive, but from what Brad said, and from what the murmurings on the street be, and we know how, well, super duper reliable they can be, right? From what I've heard, it's going to be a situation where most believe Sony are not really going to worry about it. They're going to probably focus on GNM, once again, because it's already fairly low level. The PS4 does have GNMX, which is a higher level API. It's basically baby's first step API, I suppose, on the PS4. I don't mean that as an insult to any developers who are running GNMX. But let's assume you're making... I don't know why I keep using the example of Limbo, but let's just assume you're making Limbo on the PS4. Do you really need low-level API? Do you really need those extra draw calls? Do you really need to worry? Probably not. So, yeah, just go for the easy route. I would. I bloody well would. I'd say, screw that. I'm not going to do the extra work on low-level API and optimization. I don't need to. The game's going to run at, like, you know, 1080p, 60 FPS. That's another reason, to be totally blunt. It always makes me snigger when you get a lot of sites, especially recently, that have been quoting, hey, I've not had any problems running this game on the PS4 at 1080p or, you know, 60 FPS, or the Xbox One on 1080p 60 FPS. And if you think about it, you look at the game and you think to yourself, I'm pretty sure my mobile phone could run this at 1080p at 60 FPS. I bloody well hope that the, you know, the next generation system that's costing like 350 Great British pounds or whatever the hell it costs in your currency is not going to have a sodding issue running this at 1080p 60 FPS, or I want my bloody money back, to be totally honest. Anyway, it's a bit of a rant, a bit of a ramble. The point being, however, I think it's good news for everyone involved. I think the PS4 is going to benefit from this. Developers are definitely going to benefit from this because, well, they're probably not going to tear their hair out so much. Us gamers are going to benefit from this. But you're going to say to yourself, what about actual frame rates? I mean, are they really going to go up? Well, arguably they could. Or developers could say, hey, I'm just using a figure, but let's just say the DirectX 12, and this is not actual figures, I'm just pulling this literally out of my ass, but let's just say that DirectX 12 gives a 25% improvement to the Xbox One. Once again, I'm pulling that out of my ass. Do not quote me on that. I'm physically just pulling it out of my ass as a pure example. Does that mean that we're going to be seeing 25% higher resolution, or does that mean that we're going to be seeing frame rates that suddenly, possibly for some games, but at the same time, developers might say, hey, those are extra draw calls for the Xbox One, or hey, we could go and add extra shadow details, or what have you. And so it doesn't necessarily translate to more titles at 1080p 60 FPS. It could just mean that it's going to translate to better looking games, which on certain games I can see why. You know, certain games aesthetically 30 FPS, I'm saying this through grit teeth, but some games 30 FPS is acceptable. It's not ideal, but it's acceptable. Anyway, this has been a bit of a ramble, a little bit of a meander, if you will, but hopefully you've enjoyed the video and found it somewhat, I don't know, somewhat interesting, perhaps. But for now, take care of yourselves, and if you could do the normal share, like, subscribe, and all the other usual bollocks that YouTubers ask you to do because they need them shares, I would greatly appreciate it. But with that said, I'm going to close out, but check out the article if you need more information. Definitely stick around for the next few days because we've got a lot more stuff coming up, including the bloody Radeon review, which has just been put on hold because I've started working in London and, well, GDC, and we also had some problems with our rig. Basically, the card wouldn't quite fit into one of the rigs, so we had to order a new chassis and other bits and bobs. It was a whole thing, is pretty much what I'm saying. But with that said, take care and bye for now.